Get revenge on my wife for me.
13 days after my son passed away suddenly, a letter from him arrived addressed to me.
Get revenge on my wife for me.
Below these words was an address I didn't recognize. Is this where you want me to go, Mark? I couldn't stop crying for a while, but now cold sweat was pouring out instead. I couldn't imagine Mark using a word like revenge. He must have been pushed to the brink. What will I discover if I go there? After his funeral, I stayed cooped up at home, but now I rushed out of the house. I was so preoccupied that I even forgot to put on makeup. But right now, that didn't matter. I just wanted to fulfill my beloved son's wish. Driven by that single-minded desire, I hurried to the address written in the letter. The place Mark specified in his letter was a rental storage unit a little distance from my house. Among the rows of storage units, I found the one with the number written in the letter. I inserted the small, thin key that was attached to the letter into the keyhole and opened the door to the storage unit. The small room, about 6 square meters, was dimly lit and slightly musty, even though it was daytime. When I pressed the fluorescent light switch next to the door, the exposed bulb buzzed as it lit up the room. What is this? My body instinctively felt fear, and I started trembling all over. My name is Susan Carter. I am a part-time employee who turned 54 this year. I lost my beloved husband 20 years ago. He mentioned he wasn't feeling well, and soon after, he passed away. His end was so sudden that I still can't believe it. He wasn't suffering from any major illness and had regular health checks every year. Despite that, he left me and our son behind. After my husband passed away, I lived with our son, Mark. At that time, Mark was still in elementary school, and he seemed to have a harder time accepting his father's sudden death than I did. After that, my in-laws frequently came over to help take care of Mark. In response to our efforts, Mark seemed to be desperately hiding his loneliness without his dad. He even encouraged me when I had panic attacks. "Mom, you'll be okay because you have me." His young voice still echoes in my ears. To raise Mark, I started working part-time and tried to forget my sadness by keeping busy. Mark never complained about my absence from home due to work. Even though he must have been lonely, he never uttered a word of complaint and kept encouraging me. In return, I slowly began to overcome my sorrow over time. During his middle and high school years, Mark started working part-time jobs to support the household. He worked while balancing his studies to prevent me from overexerting myself. He was an excellent student and was often praised by his teachers, which sometimes made me blush during parent-teacher conferences. I was grateful every day that despite losing his dad, Mark grew up to be such a fine young man. After graduating from high school, Mark started working right away. He had grades that could get him into any university, but he probably thought about me. "I'm tired of studying," he said, and began working at a small local factory. Mark, who was naturally bright, quickly learned the ropes and was well liked by everyone at the factory. Even though the work was physically demanding, he seemed fulfilled every day. About 6 months later, Mark found a girlfriend. He used to stay home all the time on his days off, but now he went out almost every week. As a mother, I felt a bit lonely, but I was also relieved that my grown-up son had found someone special. More than anything, I was happy to see Mark enjoying himself. He had always been considerate of me and supported me. I want him to think about his own happiness from now on. I watched over Mark's relationship. The year Mark turned 27, he decided to get married. His fiancée was a woman 2 years older than him, named Sarah. When they got engaged, Mark brought Sarah to introduce her to me. While Mark was rather plain, Sarah was a striking beauty with distinct features. It was surprising that Mark brought home such a woman, and even more surprising that they met at a bar. Though I was taken aback by this side of my son, I had no negative impression of Sarah. I heard that she worked in sales at a cosmetics company. Maybe because of her job, she was a good talker, and our meeting ended on a pleasant note. Soon after, they had their wedding, and Mark moved out to live with Sarah.
Mom, are you sure you'll be okay alone? Even though it's still in the same state, it's a bit far.
Mark worried about me up until the moment he moved. Sarah, too, seemed concerned about me living alone, and there was even talk of us all living together at one point. It was a kind offer, but I couldn't impose on Mark any further. I politely declined their offer and blessed their new life together. Even after that, Mark visited me often, but he started losing weight, perhaps due to his new job. Mark had switched jobs to be closer to Sarah's company, but it seemed to be taking a toll on him. Instead of the small factory he was used to, he had taken on a sales job, and the stress was affecting his appetite. Have you lost more weight? It's good to work hard, but it's bad if it ruins your health. I said this to Mark every time he came over, but he always brushed it off with, "I'm fine," and showed no intention of changing jobs. I had assumed the stress of an unfamiliar job was the only issue, but it took me a long time to realize there was more troubling Mark. "Since he doesn't listen to me, could you talk to him, Sarah? He's so stubborn." 3 years after Mark and Sarah got married, Mark turned 30. By that time, Mark looked pale and seemed to be at the brink of his physical limits. I repeatedly suggested, "Why not change your job if it's too hard?" But Mark stubbornly refused it. Maybe it was his sense of responsibility after getting married to Sarah. Seeing no improvement, I contacted Sarah and asked her to encourage Mark to find a new job. Sarah, too, was worried about Mark's declining health and tearfully apologized to me, saying, "It's because of me." "Sarah, you haven't done anything wrong. Mark has always been a hard worker and tends to overdo it. But he's more likely to listen to you than to me." Honestly, I had grown frustrated with Sarah for not taking any action to help Mark, even as his health worsened. I had asked Sarah many times to look out for him, but she would just apologize without taking any concrete action. Yet, I couldn't blame Sarah directly and could only watch as Mark's condition deteriorated. A few days after contacting Sarah, I still hadn't heard from her. She should understand how worried I am by now. Isn't it normal to at least give me a call? Worried about Mark, I grew increasingly irritable over small things. Calming myself, I decided to call her. "Sarah, did you talk to Mark after our last conversation?" Choosing my words carefully, I asked Sarah. After a brief pause, an unbelievable response came. No, it wasn't words. It was a sigh. Over the phone, I clearly heard Sarah sigh.
"Susan, I'm also busy with work. I'm keeping an eye on Mark's health. Aren't you being a bit overprotective? If he says he's okay, then he's okay."
Sarah snapped, sounding irritated. It was a tone I didn't recognize, but it was undeniably Sarah herself. She had been pretending all along. As I stood there speechless, Sarah regained some composure and continued.
I'm sorry. I've been so worried that I got frustrated.
Sarah tried desperately to cover up, but my wariness didn't fade. For the first time, I felt Sarah was dangerous. If things go on like this, Mark might be in real danger. A bad feeling raced through my mind, but since Mark hadn't said anything himself, I couldn't interfere with Sarah. Mark was supposed to visit me in a few days, so maybe I should try to ask him more firmly then. Is he troubled by something other than work? Could there be a serious issue in their marriage? Perhaps I was being a bit overprotective, as Sarah said. But just talking to him when he visits should be fine. I would only listen. I tried to calm my racing thoughts and waited for Mark's visit. However, my decision was a mistake. I would regret this decision for the rest of my life. It happened suddenly.
Is this Susan, Mark Carter's mother?
A sudden call from the police gripped my heart with pain. A bad premonition pierced through me, and I felt faint. It can't be. No way. Even before the officer spoke, my mind painted the worst-case scenario. Part of me desperately denied it, but another part felt a sense of resignation. I didn't want to hear more. Fighting the urge to hang up, I nodded. As expected, it was news of Mark's death. Mark had taken his own life.
Please stay calm.
The officer repeated, but I dropped the phone. I forgot to even cry, standing there in a daze. Why? Mark. Like a broken record, I called Mark's name over and over. I don't know how much time passed. A loud knocking on the front door snapped me back to reality. Worried about the dropped call, several officers had come to my house. I crawled to the door and opened it. Seeing the sorrowful faces of the officers, I broke down in tears. A female officer who came along held me and cried with me. So this is real. Mark is gone. And so, I lost my beloved son. I managed to get through his funeral in my despair, but I barely remember any of it. I even forgot my anger towards Sarah, just doing what needed to be done. I had so much I wanted to say, but at that time, I couldn't. Seeing my state, the police were considerate and decided to postpone questioning me for a while. In the meantime, they seemed to have questioned Sarah, but I doubted she'd reveal anything. My instincts told me that Sarah was the reason Mark was driven to despair. Why didn't I contact Mark immediately? Why didn't I go to him right away? Regret overwhelmed me, and for a while, I couldn't even speak. During that time, a letter arrived for me. Seeing the sender's name, my hands started to tremble. Mark's name. The handwriting was undeniably Mark's. Mark should have died 13 days ago. Panicking, I hurried back to my room and opened the envelope. Letting my tears flow, I hugged Mark's letter. It must have been a letter Mark wrote to me before he died. Since there was no note and the true cause of his death was shrouded in mystery, I felt a sense of fear about reading it. But by reading it, I might understand what happened to Mark. The cause that had been eating away at Mark for years. With trembling hands, I opened the letter, which was filled with words of gratitude towards me. My body began to shake, and I couldn't stop sobbing. Why couldn't I help him? Why? The same words echoed in my mind repeatedly. As I tried to put the letter back in the envelope with shaking hands, I noticed another letter inside. What? Unfolding the paper, I found unbelievable words written on it.
Get revenge on my wife for me.
Below those words was an address I didn't recognize. Mark, is this where you want me to go? My tears had stopped, but cold sweat was pouring out instead. I couldn't imagine Mark using the word revenge. He must have been driven to the edge. What would I find if I went there? Since the funeral, I had been holed up at home, but now I rushed out of the house. I was so preoccupied that I forgot to put on makeup. But right now, that didn't matter. I just wanted to fulfill my beloved son's wish. Driven by that single-minded desire, I hurried to the address written in the letter. The place Mark specified in his letter was a rental storage unit a little distance from my house. Among the rows of storage units, I found the one with the number written in the letter. I inserted the small, thin key that was attached to the letter into the keyhole and opened the door to the storage unit. The small room, about 6 square meters, was dimly lit and slightly musty, even though it was daytime. When I pressed the fluorescent light switch next to the door, the exposed bulb buzzed as it lit up the room. "What is this?" Gradually brightening, the room revealed a desk cluttered with several photos. Around it were scattered notepads, notebooks, and empty plastic bottles on the floor. The sight was strange, and I couldn't believe Mark had used this place. Mark was always neat and organized, so this mess was unimaginable. My body instinctively felt fear, and I started trembling all over. I'm about to see something I shouldn't. This scene told me so. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Focusing on the photos on the desk, I saw pictures of Sarah. It wasn't just Sarah. She was holding hands with a man I didn't recognize. All the photos captured those two together. They were undoubtedly evidence of her affair. I had suspected as much from the words in the letter, but it confirmed that Sarah was the cause of Mark's stress. The stress from work might have contributed, but it was undoubtedly Sarah who drove Mark to take his own life. Suppressing my trembling body, I grabbed the notes and notebooks in a frenzy. The notebook was filled with detailed entries, dates, times, and things Sarah had said to Mark. It detailed everything Sarah had done to Mark. She called him useless. She hit him. The contents were so horrific that my heart screamed as I read them. Why couldn't I have noticed? Why didn't Mark say anything to me? The more I thought about it, the more my mind filled with why. Besides the notebooks Mark had written, there were also reports likely commissioned by someone else. The photos must have been taken by a private investigator. I found several USB drives in the envelope on the desk. I stuffed them into my bag and closed the storage unit door. Staying here any longer would drive me crazy. This place is filled with Mark's unresolved anger, and it attacks me mercilessly, even as his mother. Mark, I'm so sorry. I hated Sarah for transforming my son so drastically and resolved to get revenge. Why did Mark have to go through this? Why didn't he ask for help? I vowed to find the answers and avenge Mark's death in his place. When I got home, I pored over the evidence Mark had left of Sarah's abuse and infidelity. I had panic attacks and threw up multiple times. It was an agonizing task that pushed me to my limits. Regret for not being able to do anything overwhelmed me, and I couldn't stop crying. Even if I get revenge, Mark won't come back. But I can't stop now. I steeled myself and considered what to do with the evidence Mark had left. The police should be coming to question me soon. Should I give this to them then? No, that wouldn't be enough. Mark took his life, driven by hatred for Sarah and her lover. What can I do to ensure Mark rests in peace? Just then, the doorbell rang. Was it the police? When I checked the intercom camera, I saw a familiar face.
Hello, it's Ben.
The young man bowing to the camera was Ben Jones, Mark's friend from high school. I opened the door, and Ben, dressed in a suit, bowed again with a solemn expression. I invited him in and led him to Mark's room. Ben looked at Mark's portrait. He prayed earnestly for a while before turning to face me. His face had changed from earlier, showing a sense of resolve. Ben adjusted his glasses with his left hand, reached into his pocket, and pulled out something. It was a letter. Ben handed the letter to me. It was the same as the letter I received from Mark.
I received a letter from Mark. He mentioned that you had also received one.
Mark had sent a letter asking Ben to get revenge on Sarah as well. It's one thing for me, his mother, but I can't involve Ben in this. It pained me to deny Mark's wish, but I told Ben as much. However, Ben disagreed.
Revenge doesn't mean breaking the law. Mark wouldn't have wanted that either.
When Ben said that to me directly, I was taken aback. That's right. What was I thinking? I had been swept up by the word revenge in the shock of losing Mark. I had no clear plan, but who knows what I might have done alone. Maybe that's why Mark left a letter for Ben as well.
I gave this to you at the funeral, but let me give it to you again.
Ben said as he took out a business card case from his pocket. The card detailed Ben's name and job.
At the time, I couldn't explain much, so I just handed you my card.
Looking back, I remember Ben giving me his card at the funeral. He had visited our home several times during high school and even attended Mark's wedding. I remember thinking, why a business card now? But I was too shocked to check it. I hadn't paid attention to Ben's words at the time. Back then, Ben had said,
If you need anything, please contact me.
The card read, Ben Jones Law Office. That's right. After high school, Ben had gone on to study law and become a lawyer. He had continued visiting us, but all I knew was that he worked in New York. I never imagined Ben had become a lawyer. Ben had received Mark's letter and decided to seek justice legally. Having lost a dear friend, Ben resolved to help us and came to my home.
I'm taking a break from my office for a while.
Ben said, smiling for the first time. It was a familiar smile. Ben wanted to help Mark and me as a friend, so he didn't want to accept any money. He said Mark had sent him a large sum of money along with the letter. However, Ben handed the money over to me.
I can't accept this. It's the least I can do for not being able to help him. Please let me do this as his friend.
Ben bowed his head again. I hurriedly stopped him and decided to keep the money for now. Ben was also struggling with the guilt of not being able to save Mark. So I should respect Ben's feelings now. I told Ben about the contents of Mark's letter and what I found in the storage unit. But let's take a break. You must be tired from your trip. How about some tea? Ben was surely just as anxious, but I had found a reliable ally. Ben probably felt the same. We both needed to calm down first. Feeling this, I welcomed Ben as Mark's friend. Ben sighed deeply as he looked at the materials I handed him.
This is tough.
It was unclear if he said it to me or if it just slipped out. The man Sarah had an affair with was named Ken Scott. According to Mark's notes, Ken knew Mark. He repeatedly threatened and harassed Mark to leave Sarah. With his legal knowledge, Ben said Ken was just as guilty as Sarah. Even if they didn't admit to the affair, we had the photos and evidence Mark left behind. That should be enough to fight with.
I'm a lawyer, so I can't do anything in court. But I have the knowledge.
We would pursue the two people who drove Mark to his death, but that would mean Ben's role as a lawyer would end. He had no intention of defending them. So, organizing the evidence, Mark left and handing it over to the police would be the end point. Additionally, we would demand a significant amount of compensation to corner the two of them.
We will present everything Mark left to the police and see them brought to justice.
Ben said this as if to convince himself. Without saying it, he might lose his composure. I explained to Ben that I was expecting the police to question me soon. With all this evidence, Sarah and Ken would face some sort of punishment, no matter what they said. However, I still wanted to speak with Sarah directly. As Mark's mother, I had to face her. I told Ben that I wanted to talk to Sarah without revealing the evidence Mark had left. Ben agreed to it without hesitation, saying, "Of course." Once Ben organized the evidence and handed it over to the police, I wouldn't have another chance to speak with Sarah. I didn't know when the police would come to me. Time was running out. I decided to go to Sarah immediately. When I arrived unannounced, Sarah was visibly startled. She seemed to think I would never recover from the shock of the funeral. She had shown her true colors on the phone before, so she must have felt guilty. She was probably worried about what I might say. "I know everything from Mark. He won't come back, but apologize to him now. Apologize to Mark." Seeing Sarah living her life as usual pushed me to my limit. Before I knew it, the words had come out of my mouth.
What are you talking about? Why should I apologize? What did I do?
Sarah's face froze, and she became frantic upon hearing my words. This reaction showed me that Sarah hadn't been at ease these past few weeks. She had been worried about when her crimes would be exposed. That's why she reacted so sensitively and lost control. She might fool the police, who didn't know the truth, but she couldn't fool me. Because I knew everything from Mark. "You're having an affair with a man named Ken. You've done terrible things to Mark. It's all your fault. You took Mark from me." I chose my words carefully and threw them at Sarah, hitting her where it hurt. As expected, Sarah became more frantic.
I don't know. I didn't do anything.
Sarah covered her ears and shook her head wildly. Her mind had already been broken. My arrival had shattered her completely. Sarah collapsed, repeating the same words through her tears.
I'm sorry.
Why didn't I realize this sooner? If she was this weak, just a few strong words from me might have changed her attitude towards Mark. It was pathetic to think that someone like her had tormented Mark. I called Ben from the scene and explained what had happened. Ben decided to explain everything to the police right then and there. He hadn't expected things to be resolved so quickly and seemed taken aback. He had thought Sarah would resist more and never admit to her crimes. But in the end, it was surprisingly anticlimactic. I later learned that Sarah had never expected Mark to take his own life. She had thought that by harassing him, Mark would ask for a divorce. Without evidence of the affair, they believed they wouldn't have to pay any compensation and didn't plan to admit to the infidelity. Ken intended to insist they were just friends. It was absurd, but they both thought it would work. Mark didn't file a lawsuit with the evidence he gathered because he loved Sarah. He was hoping she would regret her actions and cut ties with Ken. However, he must have realized that his wish wouldn't come true. Though he could have sought revenge himself, Mark was too distressed to think clearly. He couldn't bring himself to sue Sarah. Unaware of Mark's kindness, Sarah continued to torment him. With Ben's contact, the police quickly arrived, and both Sarah and Ken were questioned again. Ken was found soon after, and with the evidence Mark left, their crimes were exposed. Since then, Sarah has been unable to speak properly. Even after receiving a guilty verdict along with Ken, she remains in a police hospital. This case became national news, and Sarah and Ken's crimes were widely known. It was acknowledged that their actions led Mark to take his life. Thanks to Ben's efforts, the compensation claims were also flawlessly handled. Unsurprisingly, Ken lost his job. His crimes became known to his company and friends, and he lost every acquaintance. Even if he returns to society, he will have to continue paying the compensation and will remain a subject of gossip. Such was the gravity of their crimes. Sarah remains in the same condition, and doctors say there's no hope for recovery. She continues to say, "I'm sorry," and can't sleep without medication. Their crimes were exposed, and they received justice according to the law. But Mark will not come back. Did we fulfill Mark's final wish? After seeing them convicted, Ben returned to New York.
Thank you for everything. I can't feel fully at peace, but perhaps I was able to honor Mark's wishes.
Ben said this with a dark expression as he bid me farewell. Mark was fortunate to have a friend like you, Ben. Thank you so much. When I expressed my deep gratitude, Ben, looking flustered, replied,
I just did what I could as his friend. Please don't be so formal.
Ben smiled and walked away. If it weren't for Ben, I don't know what would have happened to me in my state of despair. Hiding his own anger, Ben stayed calm and ensured justice was served for both of them. As I bowed my head again, Ben had already turned away, and I watched his back for a while. Later, Ben started a volunteer organization to help those with various problems. It allowed even the poor to know their legal rights and get help without worrying about money. His regret over not being able to save Mark must have driven him. He continues this work alongside his job, helping many people. A few weeks ago, he visited again. During that visit, he introduced me to his wife and their newborn baby. No matter how busy he is, he always visits a few times a year. Mark must be happy about that. As for me, I quit my part-time job. I felt there was something only I could do. Though I don't have the knowledge or power Ben has, there are things I can do. I decided to volunteer to provide emotional support to people who have lost loved ones. I joined a group run by a psychiatrist living nearby and now face many different people. Thanks to Ben, I was saved and was able to recover. I want to help those who, like me when I lost Mark, are drowning in despair. With these thoughts in mind, I began my volunteer work. As I continued, I felt more and more that this was where I belonged. I wasn't just helping families in grief, I might also be able to save people like Mark. Driven by this feeling, I grew close to the psychiatrist who had founded the organization. This was never my intention, and I felt guilty towards my late husband and Mark. But maybe it's okay for me to be happy too? I started to think this way and slowly began a relationship. Moving forward, even if I find love again, I will never forget my husband and Mark. I intend to live my life carrying their memories with me. So, it's okay for me to be happy, right?